Hello, where to go? Oh, okay.
Oh, brilliant.
This one is not working. Yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the session on the left's agenda for Britain and the world. I'm Jessica Toale. I'm co-chair of the Labour Foreign Policy Group and a councillor in Westminster. It's my pleasure to chair this panel today. You'll all know it was a tumultuous 2022, and it looks like that's going to continue into 2023 and beyond. We're coming up to the 1-year anniversary of the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine. We've seen the protests in Iran continue. We've seen the rolling back of women's rights in Afghanistan, market turmoil, democratic backsliding, the impacts of climate change looming large. Lots of challenges for Labour to think about, confront and develop their policy around. And it's as we come into 2024 and a potential general election, it's even more important that Labour has a credible and progressive position on foreign policy. So this panel is here to explore just those questions. What are the big challenges the UK is facing with respect to Britain's role in the world? And how does that compare to other countries? What should the Labour Party be prioritising in terms of its foreign policy coming into the next general election? And what lessons can the British left learn from partners and sister parties in other European countries? So I'm delighted now to introduce our first speaker, Catherine West, MP, who is the Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacific. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and it's a delight to be sat next to a new Westminster councillor, which was one of our wonderful Labour gains from the last election, and I hope that we have more Labour gains at the next general election. So it's a real pleasure to be here at the New Year conference, and it's such a vital time for Britain in the world, and I'm very pleased to outline in a very brief 5-minute, 14-second presentation, I've timed it, outlining our vision for a progressive foreign policy. And as Jessica has said, the past year have seen much of the certainties of foreign policy have been ripped up. For example, assumptions that we would never again see war on European soil. That assumption died on the plains of Ukraine in the face of Putin's neo-colonial land grab and the disgraceful attacks on civilians in Bucha and Irpin. Tensions in the South China Sea appear to be ramping up with ongoing Chinese threats to Taiwan, and North Korea continues its bellicose and irrational weapons program apace. It's the perilous state of women's position in society in Iran and Afghanistan, where being a former woman MP seems to be sufficient to be murdered in cold blood. Just 5 days ago, we lost the wonderful Murshal Nabizada MP and her bodyguard, who were shot dead in Kabul, and her brother seriously injured at the same time. And of course, the drop in funding to the world's poorest and most conflict and climate affected regions of Africa, the Caribbean and the Middle East lead to a sense of helplessness post-pandemic, with the progress made in tackling hunger and preventable disease plateauing since COVID struck in 2019. These major challenges coincide with the UK adjusting to post-Brexit realities as we face outward to the world. Questions over the role of the Commonwealth, rebuilding our relationship with European partners, and the stability of our own economy are crucial as we shape our approach to foreign policy. But far from being a council of despair, we in the Labour Party have the best opportunity to serve our country in a generation. The country is tired, public services are failing, our economy has shrunk by 4%, and we're on our third Tory Prime Minister in less than 12 months. The UK's authority in global settings feels as though it's at a turning point, and sometimes I do question whether our voice is listened to as much as it was 10 years ago when we're abroad. We can't be complacent, though. If we work hard and continue to highlight the failings of this shambolic government, I've no doubt that Keir Starmer will be sitting in Downing Street as Prime Minister in under 2 years' time. Let's briefly look at some of those challenges. Firstly, Ukraine, which is and will remain the most immediate pressing foreign policy challenge we face. Under Keir's leadership, we've stood squarely behind the government in supporting Ukraine's dogged defence of liberty. A failure to stand up to President Putin's cruelty and warped notions of imperialism will signal to the likes of President Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un that it is acceptable to use force to achieve their goals. Secondly, China has become a global superpower in the past decade, and its rise poses questions and challenges for all governments, with trade-offs and compromises relating to values, trade, security and investment. Some of the more hawkish voices in Parliament believe we can have a complete decoupling from China and champion this, given the very real human rights concerns and the ongoing genocide of the Uyghurs. Their shot across the bows is a wake-up call to us progressives, providing a challenge to balance our deep concerns about human rights in Xinjiang, Hong Kong and Tibet, and fears over a military overreach on China's border with India or in the South China Sea. And the question will be, of course, should Labour become the government, how we balance the need to cooperate on tackling climate change and sustain a values-based trade exchange in the globalised economy. In Parliament, Labour's championed taking action to protect our supply chains from human slavery with amendments to the Procurement Bill and Health and Social Care Bill, which we won in both cases, to prize away Chinese companies complicit in human slavery in the manufacturing of textiles. On Hong Kong, we demanded urgent action to protect British national overseas passport holders and called for the removal of British judges from the Court of Final Appeal in Hong Kong. It took months for the government to actually take action, unforgivable delays, given the erosion of the liberties of Hong Kongers. We've also given a voice to demands that Taiwan is protected and given a position in global institutions, and we must work with partners to monitor the long-standing issues between Beijing and Taipei, and make it clear that the use of force is and will remain completely unacceptable. On Iran, we've called for the FCDO to proscribe the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and it's with deep regret that the government continues to drag its feet. While the negotiations on the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran remain a high priority, the UK must also send the strongest of signals to the current Iranian regime and its misogynistic programme of government. Thirdly, getting our domestic economy back on an even keel is crucial, and I know that Rachel covered that this morning in her presentation, and it will ensure our influence in the UN is consolidated. To wind up now, crucially, Labour is unencumbered by being at loggerheads with European partners in the way the Tory party is, driven by ideological Brexiteers. Resolving the trade disputes with our closest trading partner will be an early priority for an incoming Labour government so that our economy can recover from the ideological assault it suffered since 2016. Labour will restore the 0.7% of GDP to the development budget, giving our policy positions heft in programme terms to tackle the challenge of climate change, ethical trade policy and addressing preventable deaths in Africa. So to conclude, the UK faces crucial policy changes on the world stage at a time when our economy is stalling. Labour must show that we have the vision, competence and diplomatic capacity to work with key partners who share our values, to have the energy to be a driver for social justice internationally and make the world a greener, safer world for our children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was a really comprehensive overview of some of the real challenges we face in this changing foreign policy landscape, but also for outlining Labour's plans, as well as the real action Labour is already taking in opposition to raise its values and put that at the forefront. Thank you for that. That was really a great start to the panel. Our next speaker is Councillor Shaista Aziz, who is the Cabinet Member for Inclusive Communities and Culture in Oxford Council. Shaista is also a former international aid worker and author of A Feminist Foreign Policy. Shaista, over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. So it's great to be here on the panel. Because we have limited time, I'm going to keep my contribution to 3 points. So the first one is around big pharma and vaccines. So I'm from Oxford, as Jessica said, so I'm very proud to be born and raised in the city where the COVID vaccine was developed. And we know how important that has been, not only in terms of saving lives, but also getting the economy back on track as well. So Labour's been talking a lot about industrial strategy, which is important that it does so. But this is a very mission-orientated strategy at the moment. And I'd be really keen to see the Labour Party going on record in relation to this strategy and thinking more about what Labour can demand of big business. So not only the focus should not only be on Britain being more competitive in the world, but what can we get business to do? So how can we get big pharma to work in a more ethical way and to make sure that, you know, the situation with COVID, which we haven't come out of, as we know, in terms of, you know, people around the world being able to access vaccines and those vaccines being developed in a more equitable way and being shared. I'd be really keen to find out how Labour can marry its industrial strategy with this type of work around vaccines and ensuring that big pharma is working for everyone. The second one is racial justice and climate justice. We talk a lot about climate justice, rightly so. I think often we're not willing to go and connect it with racial justice. So we know that global warming and the climate crisis has overwhelmingly been driven by rich countries and corporations in the global north. Rich countries have contributed between 2/3 and 3/4 of historic greenhouse gas emissions, and the UK has the 5th highest historic CO2 emissions in the world. So we have to face facts. The minority of the world, the Western world, has contributed hugely to this crisis. So I fundamentally believe that the only way we're going to get to grips with the climate issue is to actually also focus on racial justice. And I'd be really keen to see Labour focusing on the issue of climate reparations and working as a government in waiting to develop a global fund for that to come about. And this would include working with these big corporations so they understand that they have a responsibility to the rest of the world. And this includes financial corporations such as BlackRock. They need to stop harming creating more, I should say, let me start again. They should stop creating some of the harm that we're seeing in relation to the climate crisis. So it's a question of Labour working more with financial corporations and others to create this wealth, to create this fund, and to make sure that it's administered in a fair and just way. My family from Pakistan, and recently had one of the worst floods ever in the history of the world. It was called a super flood, and rightly so, the government of Pakistan asked for reparations, and rightly so, they linked it completely and clearly with the climate catastrophe that's already here, and the UN did the same. So I think that this movement is already building, and what I'd like the Labour Party to be doing is to be front and centre of this work. So the third point I'm going to focus on, and like I said, there are many different aspects I could have brought to my contribution to the panel, but since it's so short, I just want to focus on this one. And this is around women's rights and gender justice. This also ties in with refugee and migrant rights and climate justice, and indeed economic justice, and everything else I've spoken about. So around the world, women's rights are being rolled back. And sometimes in the West, it's very easy for us to sort of point fingers to people over there, and specifically to women who look like me, who wear hijabs, without actually looking at what we're doing in our own country and what's happening in Europe. Horrifically, over the last few years, we've seen what we are continuing to see, I should say, the rolling back of women's rights and reproductive rights from the USA to Poland to Hungary to elsewhere. And also, you know, we can see, thankfully, due to very brave activists, some of whom are now on death row, we are able to see what is unfolding in Iran, which is a crisis, and what is unfolding in Afghanistan. So we have a duty to respond to these crises. But what I would like the Labour Party to do is to understand the way that the framing of this discussion, the framing of these policies. We are not in a position where we can go around lecturing the world anymore. Okay, our position in the world has been greatly diminished by Brexit. Our position in the world has been greatly diminished, sadly, by the government backing regimes who have abhorrent human rights records. And we are still unwilling to address our own colonial legacy, which goes to the heart of the climate justice issues that we're facing, which goes to the heart of many things, including Brexit as well. So we are not in a position to be lecturing anyone. We never really were, but that didn't stop us, right? But the issue of gender rights and women's rights goes to the heart of democracy, it goes to the heart of global security, and it goes to the heart of all the issues I've spoken about. What I would like Labour to do is to be braver and bolder, and to not work in silos when it comes to our foreign policy, but to connect it to what's going on here. And I'll just wrap up with one final point, and that is that we recently had the World Cup in Qatar. What the heck it was doing there, being hosted there, I do not know. It should never have been hosted there. Yeah. We also have the next Olympic Games taking place in France. In France, women who look like me, who wear the hijab, are banned from being in public space, for being in political space. I would not be able to be a hijab-wearing French woman and occupy political space. In France, women who wear the hijab are being banned from playing football. So I would like to see what kind of response our government has to France holding the World Cup and to its massive issues around penalising Muslim women from asserting their human rights to wear what they wish to wear and to still be part of France and to be visible in their contribution to France as well. So my basic point is, let's always challenge and question our assertions of others, and let's not be quick to just focus on one country and turn our face to other countries because perhaps we think they are more liberal and look like us. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaista. That was a really powerful call for reframing about how we think about our foreign policy. And the three examples you gave of business, climate justice, and women's rights are also really great examples of the interconnectedness there is between our foreign policy and domestic policy. I think that needs to come out much more strongly in how we define our approach to foreign policy going forward. Our next speaker is Leonard, who is co-founder and director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And speaking of big business, has just returned from Davos.
Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here. And what I thought I'd do is talk a bit about the strategic environment that's going to be shaping Labour's foreign policy when Labour Party wins the next election, as Catherine talked about earlier. And also within that context, some of the principles which should define a Labour foreign policy, in which I think can allow the Labour Party to differentiate itself from the Conservative Party, both in opposition, but then also hopefully even more dramatically once Labour's back in power. So I'll start with the strategic environment. And I think there's three quite big trends which are going to shape the world over the next few years, which will mean that the next Labour government operates in a totally different world to the one which the last Labour government found itself dealing with. The first is the breakdown of the post-Cold War order. And in its place, we have a massive geopolitical competition to shape the new order. The single most powerful trend is a generational all of society struggle between the United States and China that is leading to a decoupling of technology, of knowledge, ripping apart of a lot of the ties that turn China and America into a kind of massive single economy, which people used to talk of as chimerica, but which is now the heart of an enormous amount of geopolitical competition. And as the US focus more and more of its energy on that competition with China, we're seeing it change its exposure and the amount of energy it's putting into other parts of the world. And we're seeing mid-sized powers from Russia and Turkey to Iran and Saudi Arabia becoming much more active in their regions. Many people think that Putin's miscalculation in Ukraine was partly driven by a sense that America had lost its interest in Europe and that there was a security vacuum which he could test going on there. The second trend, which I think is just as challenging to progressives as the first trend, is the development of what people are calling, in technical terms, weaponized interdependence. But basically what that means is that all the things that were meant to be binding the world together and creating global peace and harmony, the things which led us to be much more optimistic when Labour was last in power in the 90s, we now realize that they're actually increasingly being turned into tools of power and sometimes even into weapons which are driving the world apart. That's true of trade, where we're seeing sanctions emerging, technology, which is becoming a massive battleground between different countries with chip wars and attempts to stop technologies being driven. But even things like energy, obviously, migration, the movement of people is being weaponized. People are being driven from their homes as a tool of policy. Infrastructure, the internet, all of these things that led us to think we were living in one world are now actually becoming major sources of vulnerability and making people very scared of being bound together and and sharing links with one another. And that extends, I think, most tragically to global problems like climate change and COVID, where we thought that we would focus on our common survival rather than actually trying to advance our own interests and see it as a more zero-sum territory. And the third big trend, which I think comes out of these things, is a breakdown of foreign and domestic policy and the politicization of geopolitics. So as the world becomes more and more dangerous, ironically, what we're seeing is almost all countries becoming more and more solipsistic, more focused on their national interests, on taking back control, and less on how they can work together to solve these global problems. And this leitmotif of taking back control is leading to a politics of anti-immigration, anti-free trade, rearmament, culture wars, right across the globe. And as a result, we're seeing the world fragmenting more and more. But also, foreign policy, rather than being something which was sort of bipartisan and which was seen as outside of the realm of politics, is becoming one of the key ways in which politics is being waged in different countries. And I think that's why the second thing which I'm going to talk about is particularly important, because if foreign policy is not simply something which you leave to diplomats, which is somehow outside of the realm of domestic politics, but is in fact right at the heart of our foreign policy, of our domestic policy, then that dividing line between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party and what we're going to do becomes even more important. And it's even more important for us to be clear about what it is that we stand for. Conservative Party is not that clear what they do stand for. Conservative foreign policy has been somewhat confusing in recent times. It has really been all over the place, embracing China under Cameron and Osborne, and then embracing Trump under Boris Johnson, then distancing ourselves from both China and America, and it's not entirely clear what's going to happen now. Is it a global race to the bottom, an attempt to create Singapore on Thames? Or is it the sort of Truss idea of a network of liberty and a new Cold War, which is going to motivate conservative foreign policy? But so I think rather than trying to respond to these kind of swings, which are coming from the Conservative Party, what the Labour Party needs to do is to have a much clearer idea of what it stands for and to tell a more positive story about what it wants for Britain in a world that is changing and where a lot of the core assumptions that progressives had about the sort of world we were building are now, frankly, in tatters, and we need to rethink what we're trying to do. And I think that there's sort of three kind of big dividing lines which are starting to emerge, which should shape the way that we think about Labour policy in this world. The first is something which Catherine talked about, but which I think is very important to emphasise, which is this struggle between a kind of ideological foreign policy and a more pragmatic one. I think the Labour Party should definitely be more pragmatic than ideological. Very few people in the UK sentimental about. I grew up in Brussels, and I love the European Union. I spent a lot of time talking to different players there, but I think very few people share that enthusiasm. But at the same time, what you find from all of the polling in the UK is that people have a sort of pragmatic internationalism. They definitely don't want to make ourselves poorer, weaker, less secure as a result of following, kind of supercharged Eurosceptic agenda. And I think that sort of ERE ideology it has become a type of self-harm, which is extending way beyond our relationship with our nearest neighbours, and is actually weakening our policy on all of the big issues that people care about, domestic and international. I think the second thing, I'll just do two more quick ones. The second one is about who foreign policies aim to help. And I think the Labour Party often talks about being for the many, not the few. And I think the big test about Labour foreign policy should be about the fact that it helps ordinary people rather than, it should be the NHS patient rather than the non-dom. It should be the employee of a small company that's shut out of the EU rather than the kind of hedge funds. I think when we think about our policies, in all sorts of different areas. What we should have is a sort of rooted internationalism that's delivering for ordinary people. And the third kind of principle, I think, should be about taking back control rather than allowing ourselves to be the playthings of great powers in a world which is becoming much rougher for small countries. And as the world splits into blocks and more of the elements of our domestic policy are becoming weaponized, from our energy bills to how we get technology to migration policies, I think we do need to see how we can reset our relations with the European Union and other European countries with whom we share so many values, but also who can provide us with a lot more control over our future in a world where great powers are increasingly bullying other countries and forcing them to do their bidding rather than allowing them to actually have control of their own affairs. So I think a lot of these things do mean that we need to imagine a kind of reset of our relations with our closest neighbours, the EU. But I also think that it's very important, as Labour has in the past, in 1997, in 1964, in 1945, to link a story about what we want for our future and for the future of our citizens with an account of the kind of world that we're trying to build. And I think that's why this session is so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's always fascinating to hear your analysis of what's changing in the world and where Labour should be positioning itself. And I think that the key point there is, what's the positive story for Britain in the world that's changing? And I think we're getting there, and we're really working towards having a positive, hopeful narrative at the next general election. Last but not least, we have Nicoletta Pirozzi, who is on the line behind me here. Nicoletta is the head of program on European Union and International Relations Manager at the Istituto Affari Internazionale. So Nicoletta, over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. Hope you can hear me well. It is a great pleasure for me. Can you hear me?
We're just going to turn you up slightly, I think. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, try that, Nicoletta.
Can you hear me now?
There's a bit more. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. So I was saying that it is a great pleasure to be with you today, even if only online, unfortunately. Speaking from Rome, of course, I will focus my intervention in a few minutes so we can leave space for a Q&A on the UK relations with the European Union and the impact of this in its role in the world. So I have to say that, since Brexit, the conservative governments that led the UK have chosen a confrontational approach towards the European Union. And we have seen these in many sectors, like fiscal dumping, for example, competition on strategic resources such as energy and fisheries, even relations with the US. And this was mainly due, to my understanding, to the fact that they were ideologically committed to divergence from the European Union, but also because basically they had to prove that Brexit worked. In line with this approach, the UK imperialism has been resurrected, at least in the narrative, and also the relationship with the European Union was eroded through the breach of the withdrawal agreement, and also the threat to activate Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol. This strategy, I think, didn't do any good to the UK economy and competitiveness at the global level, and the numbers that were reminded before are a clear sign of this. But also, as far as foreign policy and defense are concerned, the UK, I think, has soon realized how important still is to align with the European Union, from military aid to Ukraine to the sanctions against Iran lately. So this might lead, I think, to a more pragmatic approach under Rishi Sunak's government, at least on the Northern Ireland Protocol and the TCA. And I think the recent news on key talks between the UK Foreign Secretary and the European Commission Vice President Šefčovič seem to go in this direction and pave the way of a deal in the first quarter of 2023. But I think this will represent only a small part on the future UK-EU relationship, and for sure it does not ensure political alignment in foreign policy. So I really believe that one of the priorities for the Labour Party will have to be a settlement of the relations between the European Union and UK in a non-ideological and cooperative way, as it was already very correctly recalled by the speakers in this panel. And this should be one of the main points, I think, for the 2024 elections. In foreign policy, I think there are prospects of further improvement of the relationship in the framework of what we call the European political community. This was a project launched initially by French President Macron and also then supported by the institutions, but also by partners. And UK has decided to participate in the first meeting. There are some potentials for this mechanism to grow into an intergovernmental forum to imagine a future European security architecture in the post-Putin scenario, but also for the European Union, UK, and other partners in Europe to coordinate their foreign policy. But I think more fundamentally, Labour should think seriously about reversing Brexit, at least in the medium term. Looking at the results of Brexit and looking also at the impact this had on the projection of the UK at the global level, I think it is only with and within the European Union that the UK can fully express its strategic actorness in the world. So this would be my piece of advice for now, and I'm of course open for questions.
Thank you, Nicoletta. And I think that's certainly one of the most controversial areas within Labour foreign policy at the moment. It was something that we asked on our Labour foreign policy survey, whether Labour had got it right on Europe and Brexit, and only 22% of respondents said yes. The rest all spoke and opted for more closer relationship in some way. So there's clearly appetite amongst Labour members for that, notwithstanding the real political challenges of doing it with the Labour Party. So maybe the medium term is the right time to start thinking about that. So it's time for audience questions. If please, anyone who would like to ask a question, raise your hands. Please keep them short because we're running out of time a little bit. I'll take 3 and hopefully we can get 2 rounds in. We've got the gentleman here in the striped jumper. Are there any women in the room who want a question? Yes, I can. Okay, at the back, the woman there, and the guy here in the brown shirt in front. So there's two on this side. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name is Milad Amini, a favourite member for a few years. One of the things that is quite special about the UK is our diversity and the role of women in our society in particular, which is a huge issue across the world, of course. I think one of the things I'd quite like to see from the way that Labour, hopefully in the Foreign Office, could implement is more diversity in our diplomatic corps. I think, you look at, for example, Iran, where women's rights is a key issue. We've had diplomatic relations with Iran since 1807. We have never sent a woman ambassador to that country. And I think sometimes just sending representatives from your nation to reflect your values can have a very powerful impact on a lot of countries and regimes around the world. So sorry, it's more of a statement rather than a question as such. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So I feel awkward raising it, but as the daughter of a Palestinian man, I feel obliged to raise it. Labour has been very quiet on Palestine, Israel, and we now have the most far-right government in Israel ever. What do you think Labour should be saying on the subject, appreciating the issues that Labour's grappling with?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mario Michaelides. I'm just a young Fabian. Thank you very much for the panel. I just want to ask, for most of the cabinet of the panel here's life, there's been a large section where democracy as a form of government has been ascendant. But for most of my generation's existence, we've been in a period of democratic recession where the number of democracies has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. And we've seen the consequences of that with Putin's war in Ukraine, in Brazil, even in the United States. I suppose what I'd just like to ask is, what would a future Labour government do, not only to promote ideas of democracy, but also defend them, not just in Europe, Iran or China, but also in Africa, Asia and across the world?
Thank you. Catherine, should we start with you? Any reflections on the questions? We've got one on diversity in the FCDO, on Israel-Palestine, and on democracy and defending it overseas.
Thank you for the question about diversity. I think what will happen is eventually, if we do get in, we will attract a lot of very able and sort of high-profile people, and hopefully more diversity, because I think the kind of machoism of the last few years in foreign policy and also trade have really sort of repelled a lot of what Mark was describing as real people. And, you know, increasingly narrow sort of topics has not done much good in terms of attracting the sort of talent that we need to give energy and to refresh our foreign policy offer. And later this week, I'll be coming out with the press release regarding just the numbers of personnel we've lost in the foreign policy area. You know, it's coming up to sort of 30-40% reduction since Labour was last in. So just the sheer numbers. And of course, as we all know who are involved in elections, if you don't win well in an election, you often lose your diversity, both women and ethnic minority members, and then you end up with sort of a rump. And I think that's my sort of look and feel about the personnel at the moment. And I completely take your view on Iran. Let's mix it up a bit. Let's change it. Let's see if we can have an impact by sending a woman, maybe an ethnic minority woman, somebody who's got a lot of charisma and go, rather than the sort of people who it looks like we were sending back when there were tobacco concessions in, you know, the 1800s, because it does have a sort of a slightly old colonial feel to it, white colonial feel to it. The point on Israel-Palestine, very correct to raise it, and my colleague Bambo Sharalumbus has travelled to the region twice since he took on the role of Middle East spokesperson for the Labour Party. Clearly, two things have developed in the last few years. The first is just the sheer unpredictability of Iran in the region, meaning that its links in with communities in Israel-Palestine is causing a lot of unpredictability, danger, and of course, the other big thing was the recent elections in Israel, which produced the most right-wing government anywhere. It's a bit like putting Nigel Farage in charge of immigration in this country. Because we don't have proportional representation. I don't think that would happen in the near future, but because of the very proportionate style of Israeli politics, we have ended up with Mr. Javier in the security role, who is, you know, an extremist and has been basically charged in court for being extremely racist. And obviously, one of the concerns as well is just the sense that the leadership on the Palestinian side is not very, it's not moving with the times, is not encouraging people to vote. So you're getting really low turnouts amongst Arabs in the elections, and generally a feeling that on the settlements, international law is not being observed. So we need to work much more with much more energy so that we can ensure that we have in the international fora, for example, the UN, and in the refugee arena, where a lot of funding has disappeared, which is meant to be going to Palestinian communities, that the UK is much more vocal on that, because you're right to say that it's got very quiet, and the Labour Party needs to be emphasising that and underlining it. On a recent trip to Hebron, when I went there, I was very concerned to see just how dangerous it is for children to walk to school, and there are programs actually run from the Quakers who have this place here, holding hands with children to get them to school on both sides, both settler children and Palestinian children, because it's just so dangerous just to walk to school. And that cannot be the case in 2023. On the question of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and just in general trying to get sort of Africa onto the agenda, I think the 0.7 commitment, which is our main policy commitment that we've made so far in foreign policy, we need to do a lot of work in fleshing out how that would look, because obviously Andrew Mitchell, who's the current development minister, is a big improvement compared to other ministers that we've had in this area, and not just looking at aid, but looking at development. What is our offer compared to, say, China in the region? What is our offer on a genuine partnership that's not sort of old-fashioned colonialism? How do we manage the climate challenge as partners with Pakistan and other countries which are affected by flooding or which are affected by extreme heat? And I think we've yet to flesh a lot of that out. So any ideas that you have, we'd be very grateful to have them. David Lammy, my boss, did a very big speech to Christian Aid about a month ago where he talked about it and alluded to it, but we're going to have quite a lot of money with that pledge. And I would like to see us having some heft around the programs so that we can join it up with some of those more strategic foreign policy challenges which Mark outlined, so that we've actually got programs which we can implement. I think the big difference between us and the Tories will be that we like our programs and we like matching the program to the rhetoric, whereas the Tories are the opposite. They like talking the talk. They like talking about, network of democracies, or they like talking about their Brexit, or they like talking about their free trade, but it's never actually substantiated by programs. And so what I would like to see is, a bit more of policy discussion about how we would use the extra finance, not just to improve our personnel offer and our human resources offer, but also to really enhance our program offer and focus on our strengths in the UK, for example, around science and other things that Shaista mentioned.
Thanks, Catherine. And Mark, would you like to come in on this democracy point?
Sure.
If you want to take that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. But I'm slightly worried about the way that people are talking about these things, about a democratic recession, as if there was some sort of natural law which meant that democracy was doing less good than it is at the moment. The problem is with what's been happening over the last few years is, I think, twofold. Firstly, people have been attacking democracy, it hasn't been receiving, but you've had anti-democratic forces, particularly in a lot of developed societies, whether it's Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, Nigel Farage, people like that, who have launched an assault on our institutions and on a lot of the basic principles which have lain at the heart of our politics for a long period of time. And secondly, I think what we've been seeing is that often democracies have been underperforming, have been doing all sorts of making all sorts of mistakes in their foreign policy and their domestic policy, which has significantly dented how attractive it seems as a system of government in different places. I think that there's nothing inevitable about what's happened. I think that part of what a Labour government needs to do is actually to start invigorating our democratic institutions, the way that public life works in this country, to show that politics can deliver for people in different ways, to start speaking up for people who felt frustrated and voiceless over a long period of time. What I think doesn't work as well is both Catherine and Shaista were talking very eloquently about how we can't assume that we have the right to go around lecturing others and telling them how to. And I think that is something which is quite fundamental about the world that we're going to be empowering now, where actually, it's not just that economic and military power is much more widely shared now than it was back in the 1990s. You have a multipolar world of ideas as well, where people want to define their own futures. They don't want to necessarily follow the Westminster model of democracy or have mini American systems. And I think that we do need to have a different way of understanding other countries and people's aspirations and to take them seriously, rather than to assume that they're on a sort of pathway towards our system of government. And that does mean a different way of talking to other people. But I think that the job has to start at home of making democracy vibrant, lively, to give people a sense of a voice that politics can deliver for them in different ways. And I think that the biggest problems that we've seen come from the sort of concerted attacks on that, which start at home in our communities. And I think that if you look at the US, for example, it is absolutely terrifying that how close they came to losing their institutions and their democratic system in January last year. And I think things could get a lot worse in the future. I think we should be very far from complacent about this country. We've seen our institutions tested in a major way. And I think we've diminished not just in our international credibility in the ways that people have talked about, but I think that the quality of British public life has also taken a hit in the last few years.
Thanks, Mark. And I'm glad you brought that up because I've got this note here as well. We can't lecture people. Shaista, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that in this context of the questions we've just heard.
Yes, so just to pick up from the point, Mark. So, we have to defend democracy at home. The starting point. We've got a government that's completely out of control that seems to think that it can ban people from making so-called videos that encourage people to, their words, not mine, encourage people to arrive by dinghy to this country because they're refugees or migrants. It's completely absurd. What we've also seen over the last few years, and I include Boris Johnson in this as well, is a failure of politics to hold these so-called strongmen to account. So politicians have not held the likes of Trump, Bolsonaro, Johnson and others to account when elected politicians, I should say, and neither have the media. So what we saw in the US was every time in Trump's first term, CNN went on record to say that whenever they interviewed him, their ratings would go up. And there was a complete ineffective strategy to hold him to account, just as there's been a completely ineffective strategy to hold Boris Johnson to account. And we need a robust media that is going to be independent of government all over the world, that is not going to be terrified of holding these individuals and their ideas to account. I think also Milad's point about diversity representation in terms of the diplomatic corps and other areas goes to the heart of not this whole question of not lecturing people. So it is a fact that the Labour Party has never had a woman leader. It is a fact that if you look at our front bench, it looks distinctively different to, the Tory front bench in terms of the type of diversity that's present. Now, for me, I can't really get behind people of colour who are busy creating policies that are harming all of us, including people of colour. I find it bizarre that I'm supposed to celebrate, having a Home Secretary like Suella Braverman because she's the same shade of skin as me. That's tokenism. That's got nothing to do with diversity or representation. And Labour still has a lot of questions to ask. We have to ask why we don't have enough, why David Lammy and Clive Lewis are the only two black men in Parliament. Why has that never changed in the last 40, 50 years? It's not because there isn't talent in our communities. It's because there are gatekeepers. And this also then feeds into our foreign policy. I spent more than 15 years working as an international aid worker for some of the world's biggest aid organizations. And I can tell you that I did not see very many people who looked like me. And my grasp and understanding of countries and situations in those countries was far better than the majority of the white men who were working in those countries, and they found me to be a threat because, for example, when I was working in Pakistan, because I can speak the language, because I understand the way society is constructed, I was able to get more access than them, cause friction and problems in those teams. So some of this is to do with institutional gatekeeping. It's also to do with racism. And it's to do with the fact that we have to start listening to people and communities who understand these realities. And I'll just finish up by saying to the lady who was slightly hesitant about raising Palestine, that's devastating that there's a level of hesitation around raising Palestine because of the horrific I'd like to say it's a chapter, but I don't think it is, around anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Anti-Semitism is rife in society, so it's going to be rife in political space and indeed any space that we have in this country and around the world. But we should never be hesitant to raise the issue of Palestine. What's going on there is absolutely horrific, and it hasn't changed in 50 plus years. And, when we talk about foreign policy, we have to, if foreign policy is to be trusted, then we need to bring justice for the Palestinians. And so far that is missing. And by bringing justice for the Palestinians, we can then start bringing wider justice across the Middle East. And that approach will only bear fruit if we do change this whole attitude of going around lecturing people, because Britain in particular has a very historic role in creating that crisis.
Thank you, Shaista. And Nicoletta, maybe you can come in on what the EU's thinking is around promoting defending democracy in the world.
Thank you, Jessica. Yes, I was thinking exactly that. I mean, in the last period, of course, a lot of political capital and financial resources have been devoted to Ukraine and focus on the European eastern flank, which is, of course, absolute priority because the Russian aggression to Ukraine represents a fundamental threat to democracy in the European continent. At the same time, we do not have to give the impression to have A series and B series partners in the world when it comes to the support to democracy and democratic institutions. And here I'm thinking in particular about the Global South. And I mean, I think this should be really clear on the side of the European Union as on the side of the UK, that we continue to give attention on the southern dimension, and the African continent is, of course, one of the main priorities. Now, here the issue is to understand once and for all how to do it in the correct way, because it is true that we have assisted to a new presence, a new actorness by competitors of the UK and the European Union itself. And the key point here, I think, is to recognize, first of all, the agency of countries in the Global South, and in particular in the African continent. This should be really the basis for a new strategy, also when we talk about supporting democracy, as we have seen in the past, other strategies that tend to impose models are not working anymore, especially because these countries do not see us as a model any longer. So I think we should start from here, but again, continue to keep the focus on the South as one of the main political priorities. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We have 5 minutes, so I will take 2 questions from this side, and maybe in your remarks panel, if you could also do any final thoughts as we go through. Okay, we'll take the gentleman here at the front and the gentleman there with the pencil. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Adam Tyndall, Fabian member from Hackney. Really interesting comments. A Labour government coming in is clearly going to have a number of constraints in terms of the state of domestic politics, in terms of the state of the economy. There's not going to be a lot of money to go around. There's not going to be a lot of attention and time spare to go around. Foreign policy is a large task. Britain used to be able to have a view on everything, have an influence in many places, some of which maybe shouldn't have done. Where do we think that a Labour government can get the biggest bang for its buck in foreign policy, whether that's in electoral terms, impact at home, or influence abroad?
Thank you, Adam. And the gentleman there.
I'm Andrew Colson from Birmingham. Just a comment first on the conference as a whole. It's very good at diagnosis, not so good at action, not so good at what Labour actually does. And what comes over to me from the panel is that there's so many objectives, a lot of them are contradictory and incompatible with each other, and turning all this into a practical programme for a Labour government is going to be very difficult.
Thank you. Well, these seem like good ones to end on because they're call for actions and they're calls for, what should Labour be focusing on. So I think we'll go in reverse order here now. Nicoletta, maybe you can start us off. Where do you think the Labour Party should be focusing, and how do they turn actions or words into practical actions?
Yes, I think this call for action is crucial for actually all the progressive forces on the European continent, and this is a challenge we're facing also in Italy, and also in view of the next European elections in 2024. Especially in this point of time, I think this should be really the priority. At the same time, without a full diagnosis of what has not been working in the past and in the present, a change of policy is not possible. Now I think we have all the instruments, so from my side I can only wish good luck to the Labour Party for the next elections. But again, I think that as the latest developments have shown, especially in foreign policy, we can find a new ground between UK and Europe that really goes beyond the accidental alignment we had with Ukraine, and think about a real strategy for the future of the European continent. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicoletta. Mark, should we go to you?
Sure. I mean, I think the core, in terms of the areas to focus, I think we need to just focus in a sort of laser-like way on what's going to make ordinary people's lives better in the UK. And that means thinking about their prosperity, their jobs, the technologies that we need to succeed in the next century. It's about our security on everything from the energy bill, our energy bills, to the NHS's ability to survive. And also the kind of opportunities that people have in their everyday lives. And the single biggest force multiplier, which can unlock lots of these different elements, is about having a reset for our relations with our European neighbours. I think it's right that the Labour Party is not, though I would love to rejoin the European Union. I think it's right to rule that out and also to rule out rejoining the single market. But that leaves a million different things that you can do, which will just make life better in lots of different ways, and will make people safer and richer and better able to do all sorts of things which we have inexplicably closed to people at the moment, and that's made Britain smaller, weaker, less able to control its future. And I think that is a real force multiplier, and it's worth putting a lot of energy in, because it unlocks everything from our response to Ukraine to how we get the kind of energy that we need to not get cold in the winter, for our bills not to go too high, to thinking about climate change, to, I mean, every single area becomes a lot easier if you get that right.
Thank you, Mark.
Shaista? Yeah, so just to pick up from Mark, if we were to only focus on one area, which is difficult, but I'd definitely be focusing on climate justice. So within that, obviously, green jobs, technology, the economy, but also looking at building closer links with Europe and other partners. And delivering climate justice will also create, I believe, fairness for the world's refugees as well, and give them an opportunity to hopefully live a life of dignity as well.
Thank you. And Catherine.
Thank you very much. 2 points to make. The first is really that the economy feels as though it's going to be the main kind of political debate point, and hence having Rachel this morning and being pragmatic and not over promising. And I think we've seen in other elections around the world where sort of slightly under promising and over delivering seems to be a successful strategy, let's say. Taking, for example, the Australian elections, which with the Labour Party here has done some look at in terms of what happened there. I think being pragmatic, as Mark has said, on the Northern Ireland Protocol, on the science and technology relationships with the European Union, which are worth billions of pounds, on the question of qualifications, on the question of trade details which need to be resolved. And as I said in my opening remarks, because we don't have that sort of Brexiteer Eurosceptic in our head saying we can't say the word Europe, or we can't say a group of words which has got EU in it, I think we are going to make quite a lot of progress quite quickly on some of those points. The second thing I would say, and obviously Shaista's already talked about the importance of climate, is to say that we don't know now what the foreign policy challenges will be in 2 years' time. So obviously we hope that the Ukraine situation will be somewhat resolved. But, we were almost, if you read the integrated review, which was only printed just a year ago, just before the Ukrainian the attack on Ukraine by Russia was all about how we'd never need any more tanks and trench warfare, because that was all something of the First World War. Look at it. So I think, you know, without wanting to be too prescriptive, I think it's important to talk about values and to talk about how, as a Labour administration, we can sort of provide more of a values framework to our interventions without necessarily attaching a lot of sort of money commitments to those. But I guess the strongest money commitment would be on the 0.7, which is a very big commitment, and which will allow us to flesh out our values and flesh out our commitments, whether that's with the European piece, whether that's on the decolonisation agenda and the green agenda, or whether it's on just our general, you know, what is in our national interest for our own economy internationally. And I think that 0.7 will come in very handy in terms of detailing our foreign policy. So if you're interested in this area, which you obviously all are, and thank you for coming today, please stay in touch, because Team Lammy is very keen to keep the debate going. And obviously the National Policy Forum is looking at writing all of this up so that when it comes to manifesto time, we have something which hangs together, which is coherent. So it'd be really good to have your views, and also obviously the Labour Party conference in the run up to that. It could be our last conference before the general election. And therefore it's extremely important time for policy development, and you've all got an interest because you're here. So please hang in there with us and help us to design that and put it all together. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming, and let's give a round of applause to our panel for what was an in-depth discussion about a wide range of things. Thank you everyone.